Hi, Alvaro.
Hey Ronald, hey everyone, how are you? I hope you're doing great this last afternoon of the IETF week.
Yeah, for me it's almost like the first afternoon because I was busy with some other meeting most of the week. Unfortunate collision.
Hello, Ronald.
Hi, Rick. Oh, it's time.
Yes, it's time.
It's time. Okay. Welcome to the first MANET working group meeting since November 2019. We have 1 hour of meeting time. And I would like to start right away, if you don't mind. I would appreciate if somebody could take some notes, or multiple persons could do that using CodeMD. In case not, it's not a real big disaster, then I'll listen to the audio afterwards and make notes myself. But if there are any volunteers, so much the better. Okay. Now, how do I? Yeah. You should all know this. I've lost my screen. It's the note well. So note well. This session is being recorded, and this is the agenda that we have for today. If there's anybody who likes to change the agenda, add something, add the order, or change the order, then I'd like to hear it. If not, then I would like to go to the next slide on document status. Sorry, I haven't done this before. We have 2 RFCs that have been published since our last meeting in Singapore. That's why I mentioned them for completeness. Then we have a couple of working group IDs that have been in last call for a very long time. I do apologize to the authors. I was going to review them. Lou Berger is going to go into this the status of these working group accepted and in last call internet drafts in a minute. We also have a personal ID from Lou Berger that was brought up for adoption by the group. that has also been lingering for a long time. And I think that Lou will say something about that one as well. Then we have some recent new ideas submitted by Henning Rogge that he's going to present. And I think that Henning, if you can keep it a little bit shorter, then we have some time to discuss whether or not we will keep this as separate documents or whether there's any benefit in merging them.
I will try to keep it short.
Okay, thank you. Then I would like to stop sharing. And Lou? Oh, wait.
You're not going to share the slides. Then give me a moment.
Okay. Yeah, I asked, but I can. In fact.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. I can also get it together. Just if you have it ready, that would be great. I just didn't have it queued up.
No, it's the wrong one. It's a PowerPoint, right?
Either way.
Oh, wait.
It could be a PowerPoint. It could be. It says screen sharing is being started. Oh, thank you. I think if you do a Control L, it'll make it full screen.
Did that work?
It's okay. We'll keep going. So next slide. So as Ronald said, I'm going to talk about these extensions that have been hanging out for a really long time. The next slide. So we've had these. We have these 4 documents that are quite old, and the whole topic today is to just remind people where we are and agree on next steps. From a history standpoint, next slide. So we've had the first 3 documents been in last call for about a year. The last one is a complement to the first 3. The difference is that it takes it allows for doing credit control on a per 802.1 priority bit as opposed to DSCP. The base specs do DSCP. That individual document at the time was just a little bit behind. You know, there was even a discussion of whether to adopt it or not, and we said, yeah, let's wait 1 meeting. We'll adopt it the next meeting. And instead, 2 years later, we still don't have that one adopted. And yeah, obviously the adoption call originally was started by Stan, and we had that history, and so it's a little understandable why things have slowed down. But we really want to figure out where we go next. I do have next slide, please. I do have backup slides that go through the work to remind the working group what it is. If we want to do that, I'll defer to Ronald on that. But the short answer, or the short message, is what do we do? Do we stop or do we move forward? And it's a question both to the working group and to Ronald.
As far as I'm concerned, we continue. I can say I'm reviewing them right now, but who will believe me? But I found a few nits, mostly editorial things, a few technical things. I will post those to the mailing list, and then maybe you can do another ref.
Absolutely.
And then, yeah, I would still like to invite participants of the working group to comment and look for themselves. Specifically, I want to ask Rick Taylor, on whose behest this thing was split into 3 documents, if I remember correctly.
Split into, yeah, I think we were split into 4.
Okay, 4, yeah, of course. So yeah, by all means, I want to get these out the door now, and certainly not abandon them. But
okay, great, thank you. I really appreciate it. I see there's a couple of questions. I'm not sure if it's for you or for me. Rick, you're up first.
Yeah, I fully support these. I'm all in favor of the split that's happened because I think it divides the documents into a piece on flow control, a piece on generic handling of flows to a destination, so splitting the concept of a link between 2 modems within the network into the flows, because there are software-defined radios are doing smarter and smarter things, and we all have pretty much come to the conclusion that flow-based routing is the future. So yeah, I think the merge is good. I want to say let's adopt the 802.1 priority flag document as well. It works very well as we sort of touch on layer 2. Otherwise, the IEEE will come up with their own TSN-based thing, which won't quite work with our models. And it's not a biggie. Let's just do it. And I promise to read and review them.
Great. Thank you.
Rick, thanks. And specifically, I want to ask you to look at the drafts with the link ID RFC in mind. The link identifier, because I want to see if this draft is still congruent with the link.
I had it in mind when I was writing the link ID. So the concept of a link identifier and the concept of a queue identifier are orthogonal, but they won't trample on top of each other as well. So I'm really hoping it fits together, because both of those extensions were discussed and developed at pretty much the same time. We just happened to get link ID out the door first. So yeah, right. Yes, I will do.
It talks about MAC addresses all the time. So
I really appreciate that comment, because Henning privately had asked me about the overlap, and my head wasn't quite in the spec at the time, so I was wavering a little bit. But I think this slide really shows the difference is that in the current set of documents, and by the way, the Ethernet is pretty much the moral equivalent of the DSCP, the diff-serve hook field. But in this one, it's really as Rick said, it's about queue identification, which is a little different than about link identification. In particular, we might have multiple DSCPs or multiple priority bits that map to the same queue, and you don't want to have multiple links there. Although we did talk about the notion at some point, Rick, you and I had talked about that there's really a need for an extension that takes into account the sharing of resources of contention, but we don't have that today. And this is doing it not for the channel, but for the router. I'm sorry, the modem queues. So yeah. I really appreciate you saying that. Thanks.
Okay, Henning.
I had the feeling when I saw link ID that it was just an arbitrary way to split some what's behind a MAC address. So I must admit I have not worked on the flow control very much, because we had quite a lot of issues implementing some kind of prototype, and without testing this with real radios and routers, it's quite difficult to get a good opinion on the drafts. So I think we could also use some suggestion how to implement this, not on the radio, but also on the router side, because there are a lot of half-baked solutions that work a little bit, but when you look more into it, they present a lot of problems.
Right. Rick again?
Very quickly, Henning, I completely agree. And Lou and I have got a little slot at the end of this agenda to talk about implementation experience. And one of the things that has come out of that is I think there may be a need for an informational document giving longer and better advice to implementers to say, look, we're starting to get concepts of flows and queues and link identifiers for layer 3 and so on and so forth. And I know the IESG doesn't like working groups to produce informational documents, but I think this actually has value as guidance on how to apply these various quite technical specifications.
Yes, Alvaro is waiting to comment.
So just for the record, that's not what I was going to say at all. What I was going to say is that I was going to suggest that as long as we've got this stuff moving again, we should get, before you send for publication, we should get the TSV directorate to take a look at this as well. So that we, get all the, dot all the I's and cross all the T's before publication.
TSV directorate?
Yes. I can send you a note later on how to do that.
Okay,
yeah.
Fine.
Thanks.
Rick?
One final comment following on from Alvaro about the TSV area. I know Transport have produced some informational documents describing things you might look at in an IP header in order to classify into flows in some sort of... I can't remember whether it's a working group draft, a personal draft, or an RFC. I'll have to try and dig it out. But I might ring a bell with someone like Lou or Alvaro where they talk about A and B and C and D and E and F and which, the 5-tuple or the 3-tuple or the N tuple you might want to choose for flow. I know the current DSCP flow draft talks specifically about DSCP, but I wonder whether Transport may come back and say, hey, we're working on this more generic concept of flow definition. Perhaps you should include that. It's something to go into the review. Let's not take up time with it now.
Okay, but
we actually spent a lot of time on that exact discussion in DetNet, so I'm pretty comfortable with the response if they come back with one. And by the way, the most modern is 6-tuple, which includes the DSCP.
Okay.
Understood. It's the N tuple these days.
Okay. Well, as long as you're not using encryption with IP layer. Lou, do you want to? Oh, there's Rick. Are you still wanting Rick and Henning? Do you still want to comment?
Just some comment. I was not talking specifically about signaling in the user traffic, just that we try to implement on the router side some mechanism to stop a flow until our router side of the DLAP protocol says, you are allowed to send another 100 bytes, and we found no good solution for this. This whole signaling is the easy part. I think with complex flow, to integrate this into a router that we have control over the signal flows and can say, let's not transmit this flow, but the other flow is allowed to transport some data. This is a problem where we didn't find a good solution within the existing stuff like Linux. And if you easily do this, then all the signaling is meaningless because we cannot apply it on the router side.
Rick, very quickly.
Very quickly, might I suggest those topics are being tackled in the RAW working group, which is, it's still routing area, but it's looking at extending the deterministic networking model to wireless links. And deterministic is a very soft concept. Initially, it's about hardbound latency, but some of the techniques being worked on there may well apply to just trying to increase stability, for whatever you mean by stability.
Right.
So I wonder whether that's out of scope here and is being done elsewhere.
Yeah, and however, I understand what Henning means, but I doubt if there's any role for the IETF to play. It's implementation, right?
So just to respond to Henning's point, I agree with Ronald that it is implementation. It's not part of standards. That said, the PPPoE implementations that have been out there solve this problem. At worst case, you could take that similar approach. You really don't want to come up with, they used, I think, a custom Linux driver. You could certainly do that. Have you looked into that, Henning?
We have someone thinking about writing a custom flow discipline to allow some stopping. There are ways to slow down a flow, but just with some bits per second, but not about this mechanism that says stop this one and continue it later. So maybe writing more Linux kernel code might be the only way to do it.
Yeah, I haven't looked at all the TC disciplines sufficiently to know whether or not there's a TC discipline that you could you could control adequately to implement it. But yeah, that's sort of where I would start before going into the writing the custom driver.
Lou, in the interest of time, do you want to continue with your backup slides, or?
No. You've covered the main point. The main point is progress, and I thought this slide was just good because of the comments Rick was making. I'm done. Thank you so much. I'm going to leave the queue and mute myself.
Okay, then I'll try to bring up Henning's presentation. Just a moment. Henning, floor is yours.
Yeah, I started at the beginning of this year to send a few drafts to the IETF for more standardized metrics, because the software-defined radios we have out there can deliver quite a bit of information, and we have just started to do some basic metrics in DLab, I think. So, next slide.
Oh. I am disorganized, sorry.
So I started with purely metrics that are based on the physical layer of the radio. I have stuff for other things, but I will come to this later. So next slide. So I have three drafts at the moment that could be adopted. The radio band draft is in revision 2, but the changes between revision 0, 1, and 2 were minor, so there has not been a lot of there's no added content, just some details and wording change based on external and internal feedback, and 2 other drafts. Next slide. The radio band draft is just about telling what radio frequency resources the radio is using. So you can use this for getting some kind of spectral efficiency for a metric value, or maybe just check it back against a list of frequencies that are good to use, or maybe some that you know that are not that good to use because there has been report of some jamming from other devices. So I think this has some overlap with configuration options. This is still a good thing to have a way to report this. In addition to this, it might be interesting for very flexible radios that can reconfigure frequency resources, center frequency and bandwidth on the fly. So we could use a request link characteristic method to reconfigure, to request the radio to change its frequency, its bandwidth, or things like this for a specific neighbor or for the whole interfaces during the runtime, which might be interesting for cognitive radio. Next slide. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. So
Yeah.
channel utilization just reports what the channel has been doing over time in
Shall
4
I expand
categories.
this one?
What? Yeah. So that was one too much. So it's just about what has happened with some timer counters that start at an arbitrary point and go off to infinity. So you can say what is happening, how much of the radio channel is free, how much have you been transmitting stuff, how much have other been transmitting stuff. It's something that, for example, the Linux Wi-Fi system reports for some drivers.
Survey done.
So next slide. This one is the newest one. This draft gives the radio a way to report a little bit more about the current quality of the signal. So signal or SSI, signal to noise ratio, or something like the bit error rate, most likely based on some symbol error rate below it. This can give the router a much better view what's going on the channel before we start losing frames on the transport layer. Because everything might be perfect on the transport layer, but we might have one neighbor that is on the brink of breaking down and giving us the first packet loss, and another one that has a huge signal to noise ratio left. So this might be a way to get routing metrics to change the path before we lose frames and packets. Next slide. So what's next? I have quite a few metrics left from the Mac layer of the radio. These are mostly statistics because we can see some of the statistics at the router layer, but it's a little bit more difficult on layer 2. And some of the statistics like necessary retransmission, lost frames, and stuff like this are just invisible for the router. So it would be good if we could report these statistics to the radio. I already use something like this, for example, for my DAT metric to discover if I need to send probing traffic over a link. If the radio tells me there has been unicast traffic on this link, then I don't need to send probing traffic. So this is quite useful. There's also a few, 1, 2, or maybe 3 drafts I see in terms of radio capabilities. Just something simple like, can this radio transmit or receive multicast traffic? You can use this for automatically reconfigure a routing protocol to adapt to situations like an LTE system, where the base station normally cannot send a multicast, but it can listen to the multicast of the clients because they just send everything through a layer 2 pipe and don't care about multicast or unicast. IP support, I'm not sure about this. Is it maybe interesting for a radio to tell the router, I'm a layer 2 radio, but I don't do IP version 6. There are quite a few radios out there with low data rate and low bandwidth that do optimizations on the IP layer, and a lot of them don't do IP version 6. So it might be interesting for the router to know that the router should apply some kind of tunneling to get through this node and don't waste a lot of effort in trying to establish an IP version 6 link. In worst case, the IP version 6 traffic might just disrupt the radio or crash it. I hope not today, but could happen. The last thing which we have been using is something I call service discovery, a way for the router to discover what kind of additional local services the radio provides, e.g. a voice over IP endpoint where I can connect to a voice communication channel. What we've been doing there is just that the router can provide an IP port combination for a local DNS service or the radio, and then just use DNS-based service discovery. I don't want to reinvent the wheel with service discovery, so this is just bootstrapping the other side, telling, hey, you can query me what kind of IP services I provide to you. May it be netcont, restcont-based configuration ports, may it be HTTP ports for management, may it be VoIP endpoints. So next slide. wait, Rick has, I think, an answer about a question about this.
Very, very quickly. 2017, I pushed out a personal draft on service discovery with DLEP. I came to the same conclusions with you that initially I was trying to invent DNS service discovery, but I'm very happy to collaborate on that. It should be reasonably simple to do.
We have an implementation for this, and we used it for more than a year to do to use DLEP for something else than radio to router communication.
Yeah, just some quick bootstrapping of services on the other end without having to implement something fat at layer 7. Okay, I'm happy to collaborate and help if you want.
Yeah, sure. Okay, why not earlier? Because most of these metrics have been there for quite some time. Just easy. We had implementation troubles getting something more complicated done than very simple metrics and doing something useful with it. It's similar to the flow control. I think if it's the flow control, there's a generic difficulty to do this in most operation systems, and in this case, it was our implementation starting to show problems with edge cases. So we're at the moment doing a re-implementation to resolve these. So next and final slide. More questions?
Nobody, apparently. Then, okay, you gave us a sort of a look ahead of what's still coming, what we can still expect. But but concentrating on the 3 PHY related drafts for now. What does the group feel that we should do? There are short or very short drafts. Maybe they are not. They can be fleshed out a little bit more. But ultimately, should we keep them separate or merge them? Abdus Salam. I'm not hearing you.
You have to activate your microphone. Try again.
Okay. Rick, maybe you go first then.
So talking about whether to merge these documents into one or to keep them separate, my suggestion would be this should be guided by the implementation, really. So if one of these documents introduces an extension, and you expect an implementation to either implement this extension or not implement this extension, if you're implementing radio properties, then if you can see that a radio vendor or a router vendor would say, if I'm supporting radio signal strength, I should probably also implement the other properties that I'm getting out of the bottom radio layer. Are these logically the same thing? So I can say I support extension number 7 radio link characteristics, or whatever you want to call it. And so I would use that as the guide for whether these are all the same document or not, because really I believe you want one document per extension type. It makes more sense.
Per extension type, yeah.
At the moment, there are 3 different extensions because I felt they are not that much connected. It depends highly on what kind of radio we are talking about. In theory, a lot of radios could provide all of them. The signal strength might be a little bit different, but something like bit error rate. But some radios just say, we don't have these values. And so I'm not sure if it's a good idea to merge them into a single extension point. They are short enough that they could be still in a single document, but I didn't I kept one document per extension point at the moment, and I'm not sure how much we should merge them. We don't gain a lot if we merge them.
Okay, thanks. Abdul Salam? Oh, he removed himself. Lou?
I think that having one document per extension or one extension per document makes a lot of sense. And, I think Henning just made a good argument for why these should be 3 extensions and thereby 3 documents.
Yeah, I was perhaps expecting some pushback from our responsible AD or the ISD in general on a whole load of documents.
We got a 16-bit value for extension ID, so I think someone has already feared that we might generate a few more of them.
We don't necessarily have to use them all, but okay. Rick?
So my corollary point to one extension would be, remember, supporting an extension doesn't mean you have to support every data type specified in that extension. So you could say, by supporting the radio information, you must support some sort of link quality indicator, but the rest of these things, supporting an extension means your implementation is not going to terminate the session when it receives this TLV. So there's always optionality within an extension. Again, that's complexity.
Yep, makes sense.
Still, it says a little bit more if you say I'm supporting the radio signal quality RFC, then you say I'm supporting the radio PHY information RFC. If we put everything PHY or even everything PHY and MAC together in one extension, we could easily do this, then the telling that you support this extension doesn't mean anything anymore.
Right.
Point taken.
Yep. Overall.
Hi, I'm Ruth on routing AD. So 2 points. One is, please identify yourselves. I know I didn't do it last time, but it's never too late. Especially today because we have a record number of people in the room. It's not just the 6 of us, but we had 26 right now. As far as merging or not, that's up to you guys. It's it makes my life easier if there's less documents, but that is not the objective here. Right? The objective is to produce the documents that work for, in this case, the people who are going to go implement these things. And whatever is better for them, whether they can, as Henning just said, indicate specific support for specific functionality by just pointing at one RFC, for example, that's fine. If we need to produce 3, we'll do 3. They seem to be small anyway, so that's not a big issue at all.
Okay, thanks for clearing that up. Any further questions? If not, then I'd like to continue with the presentation by either Lou or Rick, or both. I don't know.
Possibly both. Sorry, that was Rick Taylor.
Yeah. Most of us know.
Lou, do you want me to start? And I'll just hand over to you when we get to the transaction piece. Does that work for you?
Whatever you want to do. Feel free to do it all, or feel free, whatever you want to do.
I'll hand over to you with the transaction stuff, I think, actually. Okay, so Lou and I kind of were talking about the fact that we've both now have quite a lot of operational experience with DLAP. So next slide, please, Ronald. So DLAP's been out for a while now, I think 2.5 years, and we've developed a lot of operational and implementation experience. There's quite a few implementations out there, either on GitHub or private within organizations, a lot of take up by industry, which is great. And as part of that experience, we've started to spot some areas where there's a bit of a lack of clarity or some inconsistencies that really do need to be addressed by the working group. So this is a bit of a sorry to Stan and Bo, who have both missed the chance to complain loudly that their protocol's a bit scruffy in places. So next slide, please. So really, we split this into 4 main issues. Issue number 1, there's a lack of clarity on metrics. I, and I imagine others as well, who are seen as DLEP experts by industry, I spend quite a lot of my time on the phone or in meetings with implementers, expanding the text about metrics. What exactly do we mean by metric X? And I'll come on to that in a second. Lou pointed out at IETF 105 in Bangkok that there is a lack of clarity on the multicast behavior. There's a whole question over IGMP snooping, about receiver IP addresses, and I'll get onto that as well. There is an errata that I've known about for a little while, felt a bit guilty about raising an errata against a document for which I was an author, was really hoping somebody else would raise it. They didn't, so I just did. The text around peer discovery is nonsense and needs to be fixed. The errata is raised, check it for details. And the 4th point is something I will really hand over to Lou, but he's right about, which is there are some issues with transaction handling. The transaction text is okay, but if you follow it to the letter, you end up hanging up sessions quite a lot. You end up hanging up sessions when you really don't need to. It's simply a timing problem. The messages that arrive are benign. They've just got out of order. Stop tearing down. As soon as you spot your control plane's gone wrong, you terminate the session, and therefore, in most implementations, you tear out any of the decisions you've made based on what you've learned from DLEP from your data plane, and then you're disrupting your data plane. So we'll go into that in a lot more detail. Next slide, please. So clarity of metrics. There are 3 main issues. Go ahead, Luke, if you want to jump in.
On the previous slide, I think we went back and forth on a couple of different versions. For a second, I thought that you had missed the version because it didn't have some of the changes I'd put in. But I think you actually covered it nicely. But there was one key point on the previous one, which I think Henning was going to come talk about, but we can talk about later, which is the text says it will cause interruption of data plane. I think it should say it may cause interruption of data plane. I think we have a good side discussion to have on that one point. So that's on the prior slide. We can either take it now or take it at the end, however you want to do it, Rick.
I pick it up in a bit more detail on about slide 8. So can we address it then? Next slide, please.
Which slide
4, 4, please. So just talking about the metrics briefly. 3 key metrics are problems. So these are the core metrics. So the maximum data rate, it's just not clear to implementers that this is the maximum theoretical data rate on a link given the current configuration. So the classic example being 802.11. If you're in mode B, your maximum data rate is 11 megabits per second. Your current data rate is whatever's happening due to environmental effects and channel congestion, etc., etc. But your theoretical maximum is 11. That's just not clear enough in the text. Equally, relative link quality. Nobody really knows what it means. There's a lot of hand waving in the text saying, oh, it's a sort of general measure number between 1 and 100. And yeah, it's not good enough. And really, we need to tighten that up. And resources also, it went in as a good idea, but it's a bit half-baked. It's the only metric in the spec which is actually a property of a node rather than a link. So is it the resources at the modem? Is it the resources at the router? Is it the combination of resources at the platform, let's say, you know, the other end of the wireless link? And if it's an aggregate of the modem resources and the router resources, how do they negotiate over what the aggregated value should be as far as other people are concerned? So just need to drill into that a bit. Next slide, because I know we're
There's a question from Henning.
Go ahead, Henning.
just as a comment to relative link quality, now you know why I fought tooth and nail to get this thing optional in DLab, because it was for a long time a mandatory metric. A mandatory metric that had a special value that means I don't know. It became optional, so we can at least ignore it.
And that is part of the problem, and we need to just address that and clarify it. So yeah, completely agree. Lou, do you want to talk about multicast? Because this is your main push.
I think you're good. I mean, well.
Okay, fine. So there is, particularly with IPv6 multicast groups, there is not a one-to-one mapping between MAC address and IP address. So, and it is not clear in the text that if you're particularly with IPv6 multicast groups, you need to include the actual IP address data item as part of your multicast destination messaging description, particularly your ups, etc. That's just missing. The other thing is, how does this multicast information get learned? The spec sort of alludes to the fact that you're doing IGMP snooping as a router, or possibly as a modem, or you're engaged in some sort of multicast routing protocol, such as PIM, BEER, NORM, whatever, and that you've got this IGMP information. And also, surely to save, one of the advantages of DLAP is it avoids you having to run lots of protocols on top to share information, given we have a control plane already running. So the ability to include the unicast addresses of receivers of that multicast group in the messaging about that multicast group is incredibly useful. It does raise questions of how is that learned and how is that updated. So we really need to think about that. And also, we gloss over the whole IPv4 broadcast, all the Fs, MAC addresses, link layer broadcast capability. We sort of hand wave it away and say, oh, it's multicast of some sort. And that just needs tightening. Go ahead, Lou.
I guess I really should have looked at the final set of slides. So first of all, Alvaro, this is Lou. To be fair, Rick did the slides this morning, and we were iterating while I was chairing a session. So I really do appreciate Rick putting something together here. So on the question of may require the modem do IGMP snooping, I actually fully disagree. The RFC 8175 Appendix C3 says that the modem the router should be doing destination announces, and that the modem should be listening to those. So I don't think any snooping is required. I don't think any protocol awareness is needed by the modem. I think the RFC is unambiguous that the router should do destination announces for the multicast groups it's interested in. So
okay.
I strongly disagree. I mean, and with that, there should be snooping or BEER, PIM, or NORM or whatever stuff going on.
But again, you're referring to a non-normative appendix, and really that should be clarified and made perfectly obvious in the normative text.
I think the normative text does say, this is typically the exact text wording, and this is from memory, so it's bad to say exact. My memory of the text is that it says in the normative part that this is typically used, the destination announce message is typically used to support multicast addresses. So the normative part says multicast. The example, the informative part, gives an example of what is meant by the normative part. So I think it's completely unambiguous. Now that said, I'm perfectly happy to have an informative document on it that goes through it, particularly on the up and update side. I think it is ambiguous what happens there, and that was the discussion of the 105 presentation of whether or not the unicast endpoints are identified in the up and update. And I think that is a good subject of an informative document. So our the end result is the same as what you said, which is it would be good to get an informative document covering this.
Agreed. Okay, so next slide, because I'm watching the clock.
Yeah, so am I. So sorry, Henning, can you? Okay. Thank you.
Because the fourth point is the big one. So next one is this one. Sorry, this is the big one. So the transactioning sequencing. There's a section in RFC 8175 which goes into reasonable detail about the request response transaction model. Basically, when you send a request, if you get a message which is not your response about the destination, this is scoped by the destination on which the request applies. If you get a response, if you get a message back that is not the response you were expecting, you drop into a session termination state. And this kicks off the whole tear down the data plane. On the face of it, this seems perfectly obvious, but, and I'll go to the next slide because of time, if you don't mind. There are 2 or more classes, and we've spelled out about 5 cases where this can happen legitimately, simply because of timing. Because requests and responses can be initiated by either the modem or the router, depending on the type of message being sent and the time it wants to send it. You can have a router asking to update a link using, for example, a link characteristics request, while the modem announces that the link has changed. And so you get a destination update while you were expecting a link characteristics response. And therefore you say, oh, well, this is completely out of order. My session has become, beg your pardon, my session has become inconsistent. I'm going to tear it all down. That's not needed. Next case, next slide, please. The other case is when, say, IGMP snooping is happening on the modem. The modem detects a multicast group in action. The router says, hey, I want to do multicast and I care about this group. They both send a message to each other at the same time saying, we want to talk about this new destination. So the response to each of their messages is actually the other end's announce, not the corresponding response they were expecting. Both ends hang up. That's it's a bit of a dumb threading problem, but it's if you follow the spec, you hang up, and you don't need to. Next slide, please. Okay, these are not quite the latest slides, but it's absolutely fine. We've got 3 or 4 more examples of these, but they are of the same class, so don't worry about it. How do we fix this? There are some ideas on how to fix it. The key point is that all the fix ideas that Lou and I have talked about, and of course this needs to be a discussion for the working group, none of them need a change to the DLEP protocol itself. It just needs advice and clarification to implementers to say, in the following circumstances, when you've got a timing issue, you can do this quite safely, which is slightly beyond what it says in the base document. So if you get an up about a message you're announcing, then that's fine. Both ends decided at the same time. If you get an update that sort of coincides when you're trying to change it, yeah, that's fine. So really we have to discuss how we clearly express what's fine and what's not to handle this situation without A, breaking backwards compatibility and interoperability, or B, forcing every extension to extend the list of what's good and what's not in a sort of n by n matrix combination of good and bad. It'll need a little bit of careful contemplation by the working group to work out a nice way of doing it, but I think it's doable. Next slide, please. Yeah, okay, so very quickly, proposed next steps. We address the errata, that's a no-brainer. Lou and I are both of the opinion that an update to 8175 is the way to go, not a BIS document. People are implementing 8175. Let's not change the RFC number on them. That will result in fragmentation and just general. People will throw their hands in the air and say, I'm not doing this DLEP thing anymore. The IETF have broken it. So let's do an update which is compatible functionally with 8175 and gives fixes and clarifications to what we've mentioned here. The end. I think that's my last slide. Lou, do you want to add anything I've missed?
The online version has some more details in it, but it doesn't change the high order pieces. So I'll put the link to the online version
Okay.
for those who delve in the details. But
Yeah, apologies for that. I realize now that I did upload it, or I approved the upload, but now I'm using a local version that is older.
It's
my
actually
fault.
better from a time management perspective because the other ones would have taken another 10 minutes to go into the details. But so I think from a time management, you actually did better there.
And we have got 6 minutes left, which brings me to the agenda, because there I had a slide prepared and then I was going to start the discussion. But I don't think we have time for that now. So maybe it's just better to take that to the list and get some reactions on this last presentation now, if you agree with that. Henning.
I totally agree with the idea that we don't need a BES document because most people working with DLab are pushing metric data. So at least most people I have talked with, they are doing basic implementations, and these don't have most of these problems because they don't care about all these optional messages that can get from the other side. The basic DLab that a lot of people are working on is a radio pushing metrics to the router. We should not break this with a completely new, but we should find a way to give people more guidance on the more complicated issues.
Okay. I do have a question, Rick. Do you see this update document as an informative document or still standard correct?
So, Rick Taylor here. This is a discussion where I bow before our AD and other ex and current ADs such as Lou for their advice. Lou, you introduced me to the concept of a formal update. Do you want to clarify?
Sure. So this would be proposed standard. An update technically is something that an implementer of a base document should go read when they're doing an implementation. And yeah, that's a subtlety that some people may not understand, but it does. An update also should not change the base protocol operation or base protocol formats. And we're not doing that. We're just changing sort of some of the error case handling and error path handling.
I think there's a precedent in this working group with some update document having been done for RC 5444. Maybe Henning remembers. Okay, Abdul Salam, can you speak now?
Yes, you hear me now?
Yes, welcome.
Hi, welcome. Thank you, Ronald. Regarding the DLIP protocol, I've been before participating regarding this. Usually, before I remember that they either we wanted to do the messaging as a special packet messaging of MANET, or a message which is simpler for DLIP itself. So as the protocol 8175, the message is a DLIP message. It's not a MANET message format. So I suggest maybe the Henning's draft that if we are looking at frequency and the bands and all more metrics that is more little complicated or important for the router, maybe it's better to have a message format which is the same message format of the MANET routing protocols that we already standardized. And I think Henning already he knows about OLSR and he worked a lot on that. And regarding also our DLIP protocol is using the TCP. What about the UDP messaging?
Abdul Salam, thank you. Sorry to interrupt you, but we're really running out of time. So can I suggest that you take your question to the mailing list?
Yes, okay.
Thank you. Henning, final words?
Yeah, a comment to what Abdul Salam just said. Hell no. I suggested this, I think 3 years ago. We discussed this in detail. We decided to go one way. Okay. Let's not revisit this discussion, please. That's 3 years too late.
Right. So now we are really out of time, almost. So thanks to all the presenters. I had some things in mind for future work, but I'll take that to the list. And I'm quite happy to see such a large number of attendants. So thank you again. And there's, I think, one more session slot left of this IETF. So maybe go there or go to Gather Town and have a virtual beer. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ronald.
I just wait until we are killed.